The document should not have existed. Genevieve Briar had catalogued 10,000 pieces of vampire court correspondence in her 4 years as senior archivist at the Bureau of Supernatural Records, and she knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had spent her life reading between the lines of history, that what she was holding in her gloved hands right now was going to destroy someone powerful. The parchment was old, not just old in the way that antique dealers used the word carelessly, but genuinely ancient, the kind of old that carried weight and consequence. Carbon dating on similar documents from this particular collection had placed them somewhere in the late 17th century, which meant that whoever had written this, whoever had pressed this ink into this particular vellum, in a handwriting so precise and aristocratic it looked almost mechanical, had been writing it over 300 years ago, and Genevieve recognized that handwriting. She had seen it exactly once before on a land transfer document she had processed last Tuesday, bearing the living signature of Zephyr Skorzeny, Duke of the Ninth Court, one of the oldest and most feared vampires currently active in European vampire politics. Her heart hammered once, hard like a fist against a locked door. The document in her hands was a vow, a blood vow specifically, the kind that vampire law treated with the same solemnity that human courts treated constitutional amendments. Blood vows, once made, were binding across centuries. They could not be unilaterally dissolved. They created obligations that the Vampire High Court had the authority to enforce, and they had been used throughout vampire history to broker truces, seal alliances, and occasionally condemn entire bloodlines. This one, written in Zephyr Skorzeny's unmistakable hand 340 years ago, promised one specific thing. It promised that the Duke of the Ninth Court would submit to the authority of the Veltharian bloodline in all matters of territorial sovereignty, forever, and the Veltharion bloodline's current patriarch, Lord Casimir Veltharion, a vampire whose ambitions had been making other vampire nobles extremely nervous for the past decade, had apparently just submitted a formal request to the High Court to retrieve exactly this document from the Bureau's archives. Genevieve set the parchment down very carefully on her examination table, stepped back and pressed both palms flat against the cold steel edge of the workbench. She needed to think. She needed to think faster than she had ever thought in her life, because whoever had filed the retrieval request, Casimir Veltharion or his legal representatives, was scheduled to receive this document in 72 hours, and once they had it in hand, they could walk into the High Court and use it to legally bind Zephyr Skorzeny to a subordinate position that would effectively hand them control over an enormous stretch of vampire territorial rights across 3 countries. The question that burned brightest in Genevieve's mind was not a legal one. It was not even a political one. It was deeply, uncomfortably personal. Why had Zephyr Skorzeny's signature appeared on a document submitting to another bloodline's authority? Vampires of his rank did not make that kind of vow voluntarily. The aristocratic pride of the old courts ran in their blood as literally as anything else did, which meant either this vow had been made under coercion, or it had been forged, or there was a context here so enormous and so carefully buried that 3 centuries had not been enough to properly hide it. Genevieve pulled out her phone and stared at the contact she had saved under the name Bureau Liaison, Ninth Court. She had never used it. It had been given to her 18 months ago during a routine credential exchange when she had processed a collection of Skorzeny family documents. The vampire who had handed her the card had been one of Zephyr's attendants, a cold, polished young vampire named Leofric, who had looked at her the way a cat looked at something it had not yet decided to bother eating. She dialed. Frick answered on the second ring, which surprised her. "Archivist Briar," he said, and his voice carried the faintly musical inflection that older vampires often had, like language that had been practiced in too many centuries to remain entirely natural. "This is unexpected." "I have a situation," Genevieve said, keeping her voice level. "It involves your principal, and I need to speak with him directly. Tonight, if possible." There was a pause. "His Grace does not typically—" "I know what His Grace typically does," Genevieve said, and there was just enough iron in her voice that Leofric went quiet. "Tell him the Bureau has pulled a document from the Veltharion retrieval request. Tell him I know whose handwriting is on it, and tell him that the retrieval window closes in 72 hours. He will understand why that is urgent." Another pause, longer this time. "I will relay the message," Leofric said finally. "Remain available." He hung up. Genevieve locked the document back in the restricted access vault, logged out of the archive system, and sat in the dimly lit hallway outside her office, with her coat pulled tight around her shoulders and her mind running at full speed. She had not made a mistake about the handwriting. She was too careful for that, too trained. She had spent 3 years at the University of Edinburgh, studying historical document authentication, before the Bureau had recruited her, and she had worked with vampire script long enough to know that each of the old bloods had handwriting patterns as individual as fingerprints, shaped by the neural pathways of centuries of muscle memory. You could not fake that kind of consistency, not over 300 years and not across 2 separate documents. The call came back 40 minutes later, not from Leofric, from a number she did not recognize, which resolved into a voice she had never heard but somehow instantly knew, deep and unhurried, and carrying the quiet authority of someone who had never once in his very long life been told to rush. "Archivist Briar," said Zephyr Skorzeny. "You found it." Those 3 words hit her like cold water, not a question, not a statement of surprise, an acknowledgement, carrying within it the weight of something long anticipated, and perhaps even longer dreaded. "You knew it was in the collection," she said. "I suspected it had survived," he said. "That is not the same as knowing where are you." "Bureau headquarters. My office floor, do not move. The document. Do not log the retrieval request as fulfilled or rejected. I am coming." "The Bureau has security protocols. I am aware of the Bureau's security protocols," he said, and there was something in his tone that was not arrogance exactly, but a kind of absolute certainty that made arrogance seem inadequate. "I helped write 3 of them. I will be there in 1 hour. He was there in 40 minutes. Genevieve heard the security desk call up to her floor, heard the particular quality of silence that fell over the open plan office when something significant walked through the front doors, and she was already standing when the elevator opened, and Zephyr Skorzeny stepped out into the pale fluorescent light of the Bureau's 4th floor. She had seen photographs. They had not prepared her. He was tall, not theatrically so, but in the way that made space rearrange itself around him. His hair was the white of old snow, pulled back from his face with a simplicity that somehow managed to look more formal than an elaborate style would have. His skin was the cool, even white marble tone that marked the oldest vampires, the ones who had not needed sunlight. For so long they had forgotten what warmth felt like from the outside. He wore a dark coat over a charcoal suit, and his eyes, when they landed on her, were the color of deep river water in winter, gray and green and utterly still. He looked like exactly what he was. Something ancient wearing the shape of a man and doing it with extraordinary grace. "Archivist Briar," he said, crossing the floor toward her with a quiet, deliberate ease. The two men who had come with him, not Leofric, but two others, broader and more openly watchful, stayed near the elevator without being told. "You were discreet on the phone." "I try to be," she said. She did not offer her hand. Something about him made the gesture feel inadequate, like offering a candle to a lighthouse. "I need you to understand that I am still a bureau employee. My first obligation is to the legal integrity of this archive. Whatever this conversation involves, that does not change." He stopped 3 feet away from her and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something between assessment and something warmer and more careful. "I would not ask you to compromise your integrity," he said. "I am here to provide context. What you do with that context is your professional decision. Then let us go somewhere we can talk." She brought him to the restricted consultation room, a windowless space the bureau kept for exactly this kind of sensitive meeting, and placed the document on the table between them after retrieving it from the vault. She watched his face when he saw it. Something moved behind his eyes. Not pain exactly, something older and more compressed than pain. "You do not need to authenticate it," he said quietly. "It is genuine. I know it is genuine," Genevieve said. "I need to know what it means." He sat down across from her, a deliberate choice, she thought, when he could have remained standing and used his height to dominate the space. He sat, and he folded his hands on the table, and he looked at the document for a long moment before looking at her. "In 1683, he said, there was a massacre. A village in what is now Austria, 17 humans, 3 vampires of minor standing, killed by a faction loyal to the Veltharian bloodline, not the current patriarch, but his ancestor, Branimir Veltharion, who was then attempting to consolidate territorial control across the eastern courts." His voice was even and precise, but she noticed that his hands tightened slightly against each other as he spoke. "I was the ranking noble in that region. I had failed to stop it." Genevieve stayed very still. In the aftermath, there were 2 surviving vampires whose protection fell to me under the old court codes. A woman named Elspeth and her son, Branimir Veltharion, made it very clear that he intended to reach them, that the massacre had been, in part, a demonstration of what would happen if they were not surrendered. He paused. "I could not protect them by force alone. My court was strong, but not strong enough to withstand a full Veltharion campaign, so I did the only other thing that was available to me." "You made a vow," Genevieve said. "I made a vow," he confirmed. "I submitted to territorial authority in exchange for Branimir's guarantee that Elspeth and her son would never be touched, that the full weight of the Veltharian bloodline's old-world honor would stand between them and any harm." He let out a slow breath. Branimir held to his word. Elspeth and her son lived out their natural lives safely. "I considered the vow a closed matter. The circumstances that created it were gone. The people it protected were gone. And I believed the document itself had been destroyed." "It was not destroyed," Genevieve said. "It was misfiled in the Danube Valley collection, probably during one of the 17th century archive transfers. It has been sitting in bureau storage for at least 100 years. And Casimir Veltharion found out it existed," Zephyr said. "His retrieval request was submitted 6 days ago." Genevieve confirmed, flagged routine, which is why it took until today to reach my desk. He cited historical research purposes. The quality of silence that followed was the kind that had mass. If he presents this to the High Court, Zephyr said, they will be obligated to enforce it. The vow's language is absolute. It does not specify duration. It does not contain a sunset clause. Under blood law, a vow made without time limits is considered permanent. I read it 3 times, Genevieve said. I know what it says. He looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that made her feel fully seen rather than observed. A distinction she had not expected to feel in the company of someone so completely outside her ordinary world. "Why did you call me?" he asked. "You could have processed the retrieval request. It would have been legal. It would have been the simplest path. The simplest path is not always the right one," she said. "And I am not in the business of handing documents over without understanding what they mean. The Bureau exists to preserve historical truth, not to become a weapon for whoever happens to file the correct paperwork first." She held his gaze. "Also, I know what Casimir Veltharion has been doing in the Eastern Territories. The Bureau processes a great deal of court correspondence, and I have read enough of it to know that he is systematically acquiring leverage over every major noble house he can reach. This vow is not a historical curiosity to him. It is a tool." Zephyr was quiet for a moment. "You have been paying attention. It is literally my job," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved. "Just slightly. Now, let us talk about what can actually be done, because I have thought about this for the past hour and a half, and I have identified several possible approaches, none of which are simple." He leaned forward slightly, and something in the set of his shoulders shifted, a barely perceptible relaxation, as if he had braced for something and found it unnecessary. "Tell me." She had made notes on her phone. She pulled them up without apology, because she thought clearly when she organized her thoughts, and she was not going to perform vagueness for the benefit of his dignity. "First option," she said. "The document is declared inauthenticated on procedural grounds. A problem with the chain of custody, a gap in the collection records. It happens. Documents get rejected from retrieval requests regularly when the provenance cannot be fully established. I can make a case for it. The weakness is that if Casimir has his own documentation supporting the vow's existence, letters, secondary sources, witness records, the High Court can rule that the vow is enforceable regardless of the physical document's status." "He will have secondary sources," Zephyr said. "Casimir is thorough." "Then that approach only buys time," Genevieve said. "Option. The vow is challenged at the High Court on the grounds that the circumstances that created it no longer exist. Blood law does have a provision, narrow, rarely used, but present for vows made under coercive threat to third parties. If the third parties are no longer at risk, the vow could be argued to have fulfilled its purpose, and lapsed Branimir's descendants could counter that the vow was territorial in nature, not protective," Zephyr said. "And the High Court has historically sided with strict textual interpretation of blood vows, which is why I said none of these are simple," Genevieve said. "Third option. You challenge Casimir Veltharion directly, not the vow, but his right to invoke it. Blood law also specifies that a vow made to prevent a specific bloodline from committing specific acts of violence cannot later be invoked by that same bloodline to extract advantage from the party who made the vow. It would be like, in human legal terms, a blackmailer suing the person they blackmailed for breach of the original coercive agreement." She watched something change in his expression. A slow, careful shift, like watching a river find a new channel That argument has never been made before the High Court. No, she agreed, but the precedent exists in 3 separate sub-clauses of the old court codes, and I know because I have read all of them. She put her phone down on the table. The difficulty is that making this argument requires proving that the original vow was coercive. That means putting on record what Branimir Veltharion did in 1683, which means the massacre becomes part of the public court record, which means the Veltharion bloodline's founding patriarch is officially documented as a murderer. Casimir would fight that with everything he has, Zephyr said. Yes, which makes it the most dangerous option, and also possibly the most effective one. She paused. There is a 4th option, which is simply that you negotiate with Casimir privately and find something he wants more than the territorial leverage this vow would give him. Zephyr's expression went very still. That would require me to know what Casimir Veltharion wants above all other things. Do you? A pause that lasted precisely long enough to tell her the answer was complicated. He wants the Dalavar treaty seats, Zephyr said finally. 3 of the 12 founding seat positions in the Pan-European Vampire Authority. My court holds 2 of them. Could you give him one? Giving Casimir Veltharion a treaty seat would make him one of the 12 founding voices of the only international vampire governance body that has any real authority, Zephyr said, and his tone was measured, but the weight beneath it was clear. It would be exchanging one vulnerability for a much larger one. Not just for my court, for every court that sits in that authority. Genevieve absorbed that. Then we are likely back to option 3. Option 3, he said quietly, which requires going before the High Court with evidence of a massacre, a coercive blood vow, and an argument that has never been made before. He looked at her, and which requires someone capable of constructing and presenting that argument. The Bureau has legal staff. The Bureau's legal staff are competent in archive law, he said. What I need is someone who understands the documents themselves, who can speak to their authenticity, their historical context, their place in the broader pattern of what was happening in 1683. He paused, and his voice changed, became quieter, more deliberate, carrying something she had not expected. What I need is you, Genevieve Briar. If you are willing. She was quiet for a long moment. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. You are asking me to appear before the Vampire High Court, she said. As an expert witness and document specialist, he said. With my court's full protection and resources behind you, you would not be going alone. The High Court, she said again, because she wanted to make sure she was being entirely clear with herself about what she was agreeing to, which is not a metaphor for a committee meeting in a nice conference room. No, he said, it is not. Where is it held? There is a chamber beneath the old Meridian building in Vienna. It has been there since 1714. He watched her face. I will tell you everything you need to know. I will not put you in a position you do not fully understand. Genevieve thought about the document on the table between them. She thought about the 17 humans and 3 vampires who had died in a village in Austria 340 years ago so that a powerful bloodline could make a point. She thought about the woman named Elspeth and her son, who had lived safe and unnamed in history while a duke had written away a piece of his sovereignty to keep them so. She thought about who Zephyr Skorzeny had been in 1683, and who he had chosen to be, and what that choice had cost him. Give me 24 hours to prepare the documentation case, she said, and arrange transport for both of us to Vienna. We will need to be there before Casimir Veltharion gets wind that the retrieval request has not been processed. Something crossed his face that she could not name with any word she currently had available. It was not relief exactly. It was something that had been held under tension for a very long time, carefully, quietly, finally finding the first fraction of release. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me yet," she said. "We have a great deal of work to do." The next 24 hours were the most intellectually demanding of Genevieve's professional life, which was saying something, because her professional life had included a week during which she had authenticated 47 documents simultaneously for a collapsed estate dispute involving 2 vampire courts and a disputed island off the coast of Scotland. She worked through the night in the Bureau's restricted research room, pulling every secondary source in the collection that touched on the Veltharion, bloodlines, Eastern territorial activities in the late 17th century. She found 3 letters from minor nobles describing Branimir Veltharion's campaign of coercion. She found a journal fragment, barely legible, the ink so faded it required ultraviolet light to read, from a vampire named Rosalind Adrevith, who had been present in the Eastern courts during the period in question and who had described, in careful and restrained language, the events of a November night in 1683 that matched every detail Zephyr had given her. She cross-referenced. She built a timeline. She constructed a chain of evidence that moved from the massacre to the coercive pressure on Zephyr's court to the vow itself, and she documented it all with the kind of methodical precision that she knew from experience was the only thing that actually moved high-stakes legal proceedings in any direction. Zephyr came back at 6 in the morning. He had not, she suspected, slept. Vampires did not require sleep the way humans did, though the older ones often chose it, and he came alone this time, carrying 2 coffees from the place on the corner that opened at 5:30. He set one in front of her without comment and looked at the spread of documents on her work table. "Rosalind Adrevith," he said, seeing the journal fragment. His voice was very quiet. "You knew her," Genevieve said. It was not a question. "She was one of the witnesses," he said, "to the vow. She wanted to testify to the coercion at But he stopped. "I was trying to keep the situation contained. I did not want a formal inquiry. I wanted the people who needed to be safe to simply be safe, as quietly as possible. And in trying to protect Elspeth and her son quietly," Genevieve said, not unkindly, "you created a document that could be weaponized centuries later." "Yes," he said simply. She picked up the coffee. It was strong and exactly right, which she noted without mentioning. "The case is solid," she said, "not unassailable. Casimir will challenge the journal fragment's authenticity, and the letters are circumstantial, but solid enough to make the High Court take the coercive vow argument seriously if we present it correctly." She looked at him. "I need to know something before we go, something personal." He met her eyes and waited. "The massacre," she said. "You said you failed to stop it. What does that mean exactly? Were you in a position to stop it and made a wrong choice, or were you genuinely outmatched?" The question hung between them for a moment. "Both," he said. "I made choices in the weeks before that night that I believe were correct at the time, and that contributed to the conditions that allowed it to happen. I did not swing the weapon, but decisions I made created a gap that Branimir Veltharion walked through." His voice was very level. "I have carried that for 340 years. I am asking," Genevieve said, "because if Casimir's people try to use the massacre to paint you as complicit, I need to know how to answer it." "Then, answer it exactly as I have told you," he said. "I will not ask you to shade the truth on my behalf. If the High Court wants to find me guilty of a failure of judgment 3.5 centuries ago, that is their right. I would rather lose this case with an honest record than win it with a false one." Genevieve looked at him for a long moment. In her experience, powerful men, human or vampire, did not often say things like that and mean them. Most of the time, the statement was itself a performance of virtue, designed to be heard. But something in the way he said it, flat and without decoration, like a man reading from a ledger, made her believe he meant it precisely. "All right," she said. "Then let us go to Vienna." They flew out of Heathrow on a private charter at 10 that morning, Zephyr's 2 guards occupying the rear of the small plane, while Genevieve sat across a narrow table from Zephyr himself and went through the documentation case one more time, walking him through the evidence structure and the legal arguments so that he understood every piece of it as well as she did. He was an attentive listener. She had expected that in some vague way, but she had not expected the quality of it, the way he asked precise, targeted questions that showed. He had already understood 3 steps ahead and was checking her reasoning rather than seeking clarification. He had been navigating courts, political and legal, for centuries. The logic of argument was not foreign to him. What surprised her was the moment, somewhere over the channel, when he set down the document he had been reading and simply looked at her. "You have not asked me," he said, "how I found Elspeth and her son, how I came to be responsible for them." She had not asked because it had not seemed relevant to the legal case, but something in his tone suggested it was relevant to something else. "Tell me," she said. "Elspeth's husband was one of the vampires killed in the massacre," he said, "a man named Piotr, who had been in my court service for 40 years. He was not a warrior. He was a teacher. He ran a school in the village, human children and the occasional vampire child together, which was unusual enough at the time to attract attention." A pause. Branimir Veltharion found it offensive. An illustration of what he considered the degradation of vampire dignity. "So Piotr was killed for running a school," Genevieve said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the flat grey brightness of the clouds below them. "And Elspeth and her son. Her son was 8 years old. Human, Piotr had raised him as his own." Zephyr's voice did not change in tone, but something in it became very careful, the way hands became careful around something that could break. "His name was Thomas. He wanted to be a mapmaker." Genevieve turned back from the window. She did not say anything, because there was nothing adequate to say to 340 years of grief compressed into the quiet phrase, "He wanted to be a mapmaker." She did what felt most honest instead, which was to hold his gaze and let him see that she had heard it. They looked at each other in the pale light of the air cabin for a long moment, and something shifted between them, not dramatically, not with the kind of visible seismic movement that people wrote about in books, but in the quiet and real way that things actually change between people. Like a door that had been slightly ajar for some time, finally swinging a degree further open. "Thomas grew up," Zephyr said. "He became a cartographer. He had 4 children. His line exists to this day. There is a family named Hollis in Salzburg, who are his descendants, though they do not know it." He paused. "I have kept an eye on them, at a distance." Genevieve breathed in slowly. "You have been protecting people quietly for 340 years, she said, "and trying to prevent anyone from finding out about it because it would complicate the political picture." "Yes," he said, "That is simultaneously very admirable and very frustrating," she said. Something happened to his expression then, a movement so swift and unexpected that it took her a moment to identify it. He smiled. Not the controlled, aristocratic curve she might have expected, but something genuinely startled, as if her words had caught him entirely off guard, and the only honest response was amusement. "I have been told," he said, "that I am very frustrating." "I imagine you have," she said. Vienna in January was bone-cold and strikingly beautiful, the kind of beautiful that had accumulated over centuries and wore it naturally without self-consciousness. Zephyr's people had arranged a townhouse near the Belvedere, and Genevieve found herself in a guest room that had been furnished with such careful attention to comfort, good lighting, a proper desk, a chair that actually supported the back during long working hours, that she had the sudden and disorienting suspicion that someone had found out exactly what she needed and provided it without being asked. She worked until 2 in the morning, then slept for 6 hours, then worked again. The High Court hearing was set for the following evening. Casimir Veltharion's legal petition to enforce the vow had been formally lodged, and the chief arbiter, a vampire named Lady Severaine, who was reportedly both brilliant and genuinely impartial, which was a rarer combination than it should have been, had agreed to hear a counter-argument. Before making any preliminary ruling, Zephyr came to find her at noon, when she surfaced from her documents long enough to eat something. "Casimir knows you are here," he said, standing in the doorway of the small dining room where she had been working. "He will have people watching the townhouse." "Let him watch," Genevieve said, pouring tea with a steadiness she was not entirely sure was genuine. "I am not doing anything I need to hide." "He may try to apply pressure," Zephyr said. "Not physical prohibition on coercing witnesses is one of the few blood laws that carries universal enforcement. But other kinds of pressure, like what? Professional? Your position at the Bureau." He paused. "Casimir has allies in the Bureau's oversight structure." Genevieve set down the teapot. "I know," she said. "I have known for 18 months that Councillor Brentwood is on Casimir's social calendar. I have been careful about what I put in writing." She looked at Zephyr. "I told you. I pay attention." He looked at her with that particular quality of attention he had, completely focused, as if the rest of the world had reduced itself to a manageable background noise. "I want you to know," he said, "that whatever consequences follow from this case for your position at the Bureau, my court will ensure that you are not left without resources or protection." Genevieve picked the teapot back up and finished pouring. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I am not doing this because of what I stand to gain. I am doing it because the document is real, the history is real, and Casimir Veltharion using a coercive vow to legally bind you 3 centuries after the coercion occurred is genuinely wrong." She met his eyes across the table. "I do not need your court's resources to motivate me to do the right thing." "No," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "I did not think you did. I am saying it because I want you to know it is there, regardless." She understood the distinction. She appreciated it more than she expected to. The afternoon before the hearing, Casimir Veltharion requested a private meeting. Zephyr's response, delivered through Leofric, who had apparently materialized sometime in the past 24 hours, was that any communication from Casimir Veltharion's people should be directed to the legal team, and that the Duke of the Ninth Court was not available for private negotiations. Casimir sent the message anyway, through a different channel, which reached Genevieve directly through the Bureau's liaison network. She read it once and brought it to Zephyr. It was not a threat, technically. It was a very politely worded reminder that she was a human civilian operating in vampire court proceedings, that the High Court's witness protections applied only to formal testimony, and that the time between formal testimony and the hearing's conclusion was not covered by those protections. It closed with a brief mention that Casimir had always admired the Bureau's work and would be sorry to see its reputation affected by an archivist who had overstepped her professional remit. Zephyr read it. His expression did not change, but the room somehow felt several degrees colder. "Leofric," he said. Leofric appeared from wherever he had been standing quietly. "Your Grace, double the guard on the townhouse. Have Mira and Constantine in the gallery during the hearing, and file a formal harassment complaint with Lady Severane's office. This message constitutes an attempted coercion of a High Court witness, and I want it on the record before the session opens." Leofric inclined his head and was gone. Zephyr turned to Genevieve. He was very still in the way that the oldest vampires were still, not the stillness of something resting, but the stillness of something that had made a decision and would not be moved from it. "I want to say something," he said, "and I would like you to hear all of it before responding." "All right," she said. "In a long time," he said, "I have not trusted anyone with what I told you on the plane. The details of 1683, what I did and failed to do, the weight I have carried from it. I told you because you asked directly, and because I had already decided that you were someone who deserved a direct answer." He paused. "I am telling you this now because I want you to know that what I feel toward your safety is not simply the obligation of a court protecting a witness. It is personal. You matter to me, Genevieve. As a person, not as a resource." She was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been deciding that?" she asked. "Since approximately the moment you told me that the simplest path is not always the right one," he said, "which was within the first 20 minutes of meeting you." She breathed in slowly. "We have a High Court hearing in 11 hours, she said. He said, "Can we agree that this conversation is not finished and revisit it when the case is resolved?" "Yes," he said again, and the way he said it, certain and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world, which in a literal sense he did, settled something in her chest in a way she had not expected. "Then let us finish preparing," she said. The chamber beneath the Meridian building was exactly what a 700-year-old court of supernatural law looked like, and nothing like what human imagination typically produced. It was not melodramatic. It was not draped in shadows and candlelight. It was a large, austere room of dark stone and pale wood, lit by electric fixtures that someone had chosen for their resemblance to older light sources, and it held perhaps 60 people, vampires, all of them, except for Genevieve and the 2 human legal observers that the High Court required for proceedings involving human world documentation. Lady Severane sat at the center of the raised bench, a woman who appeared to be somewhere in her mid-40s by human standards, and who had probably appeared that way for 4 centuries, with close-cropped silver hair and sharp dark eyes that missed nothing. She acknowledged Genevieve's presence with a brief nod that managed to convey professional courtesy without condescension, which Genevieve appreciated more than she could easily express. Casimir Veltharion was already seated at the petitioner's bench. He was younger than she had expected, the youngest-looking of the old bloods she had seen, appearing no more than 35, with dark auburn hair and an expression of settled, comfortable certainty that she immediately recognized as the expression of a man who believed he had already won. The session opened. Lady Severain summarized the petition. Casimir's advocate, a sharp-voiced vampire named Aldrich, presented the vow, confirmed its authenticity, and argued with crisp efficiency that the language was clear and the enforcement obligation was unambiguous. Then it was Genevieve's turn. She had prepared for this the way she prepared for everything, thoroughly, methodically, and with absolute attention to what actually mattered. She did not perform. She did not posture. She laid out the evidence in order, the timeline, the letters, the journal fragment, the authentication analysis, and finally the legal argument, walking Lady Severain through the 3 sub-clauses of the old court codes that together established the precedent for voiding a vow made under coercive threat. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes, because she had committed the case to memory in the way that she committed every matter to memory, completely, with the understanding that knowing it by heart was the only way to be sure it would be there when she needed it. When she finished, there was a silence in the chamber that had texture. Lady Severain asked 3 questions, all of them precise and exactly targeted at the weakest points in the argument. The circumstantial nature of the letters, the potential for alternate interpretation of the subclauses, the question of whether the vow's specific language could be argued to supersede the coercion precedent. Genevieve answered all 3 clearly and directly, acknowledging the weaknesses without retreating from the core argument. Casimir's advocate cross-examined her. He was skilled. He tried to redirect the chamber's attention toward the textual absolutism of blood vow law, tried to separate the question of historical context from the question of legal enforceability, tried twice to imply that Genevieve's status as a human civilian made her analysis of vampire legal code inherently limited. Genevieve let the first implication pass. On the second, she turned to the advocate with a look that she had been told by colleagues who had witnessed it on multiple occasions was the professional equivalent of a door closing in someone's face. The analysis, she said, is based on texts I have read, authenticated, and cross-referenced in their original forms over 4 years of specialist work. If the court would like a second opinion from a vampire legal scholar, I welcome that. But the scholarship itself does not change depending on who does it. Lady Severain made a small sound that might have been approval and told the advocate to proceed differently. The hearing concluded 3 hours after it began. Lady Severain retired to deliberate. Zephyr stood beside Genevieve in the waiting corridor, his court's people grouped at a respectful distance, Casimir's people grouped at the other end with the specific quality of silence that hostile parties maintained when forced to occupy the same space. "You were extraordinary," Zephyr said quietly. "I presented a clear case," Genevieve said. "Whether it was extraordinary depends on what Lady Severain decides." "It was extraordinary," he said, with a firmness that did not invite argument, regardless of the outcome. She looked up at him. In the corridor's low light, with the distant sounds of the city, filtering through stone that had stood since before any living human could remember, he looked exactly like what he was. Something ancient and powerful and real, and she thought about what it meant to know someone who had watched 3 centuries move past him and had spent them, quietly and without record, trying to do what was right. "Zephyr," she said. He looked at her. "After this," she said, "whatever Lady Severain rules, I would like to see you again." He was quiet for a moment, and then something in his face opened. not dramatically, just the way a window opened, letting in air, and he said, "I would like that very much." Lady Severaine returned in 40 minutes. Her ruling was careful, detailed, and unambiguous. The Rosalind Adrevith journal, combined with the 3 corroborating letters and the documentary analysis presented by the Bureau's archivist, established sufficient historical context to trigger a review under the old court code's coercive vow provisions. The review would require a formal evidentiary proceeding, not a summary judgment, which meant the enforcement of the vow was suspended pending that proceeding. Additionally, Casimir Veltharian's attempted coercion of a high court witness, the message to Genevieve, now formally entered into the record, had been referred to the High Court's disciplinary panel and would carry its own consequences. The vow was not voided, not yet. But it was suspended, which meant Casimir could not use it, which meant the weapon he had spent months building up to wielding had just been removed from his hands and placed in a locked room while the court argued about whose hands it should be in. It was not a complete victory, but it was the beginning of one. In the corridor outside the chamber, Casimir Veltharion walked past Zephyr without stopping, but his eyes moved to Zephyr's face for one moment, and what was in them was not the comfortable certainty of before. Genevieve watched that look and filed it away carefully, because a man whose certainty had been shaken was sometimes more dangerous than one whose certainty was intact. But not tonight. Tonight, she let herself breathe. The city was cold and clear when they came out of the Meridian building, the January stars sharp overhead, and Zephyr fell into step beside her as naturally as if they had been walking together for years. "The evidentiary proceeding," he said. "It will take months, probably closer to a year," she said. "These things move slowly when the history goes back 3 centuries. She pulled her coat tighter. "I will need to be involved in some capacity. The Bureau will need to formally assign me to the case, which means I need to brief my director tomorrow morning and explain why I have spent the past 3 days in Vienna." "Your director will be difficult," Zephyr said. "Director Ambrose is not difficult," she said. "He is careful. There is a difference. I will make the case, and he will assign me if the case is sound." She paused. "Which it is." "You are very certain of yourself," Zephyr said, and his tone was warm rather than challenging. "Yes," she said simply. "It is one of my better qualities. It is an excellent quality," he said. They walked for a few steps in silence, the guards trailing at the respectful distance that Zephyr seemed to be able to establish purely through some quality of his bearing. "The Hollis family," Genevieve said, "in Salzburg. Thomas's descendants," she said. "You have been watching them at a distance for 300 years. Have you ever?" "No," he said. "I have never introduced myself. It would only raise questions I could not answer without revealing more than was safe." She thought about that. "When this is resolved," she said, and she said "when" deliberately because she believed it, and she thought he needed to hear someone believe it. "You could find a way to tell them. Not everything, but something. That Thomas Hollis mattered to someone who remembered him." Zephyr was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, very quietly, "I have thought about that for a long time." "I know," she said. "I think the reason you have not done it is not because it is impossible, but because it would make it real in a way that is painful. The distance is easier." He turned to look at her, and his expression was so open and unguarded in that moment that it caught her completely off guard, not because it was unexpected in his character as she was coming to understand it, but because the openness was directed at her with such complete directness. "You see things very clearly," he said. "It is the archivist in me," she said softly. "Everything that exists leaves a record, even what people try to keep hidden." "Especially that," he agreed. Over the months that followed, the evidentiary proceeding took its predictable, grinding course through the High Court's machinery. Genevieve was formally assigned to the case by Director Ambrose, who had indeed been careful and demanding during the briefing, but who had ultimately agreed that the Bureau's integrity was best served by seeing the case through properly. She made 4 more trips to Vienna. She spent long days in the High Court's document library. She built the evidentiary record with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything. And Zephyr was there for much of it, not always visibly. He had a court to run, obligations across 3 countries, political relationships that required his presence and attention, but consistently. He called when he said he would call. He read every document she sent him and responded with observations that were always sharp and occasionally surprising. When she was in Vienna, he was in Vienna. When she was in London, he visited London with enough regularity that Leofric's polite discomfort at his principal's continued scheduling detours became a running undercurrent in the logistics of the proceedings. They had dinner together for the first time on a Tuesday in February in a restaurant in London's oldest district that turned out to be owned by one of Zephyr's former court members, a vampire named Isolde, who had retired from court politics sometime in the 1940s and had been running the restaurant with evident satisfaction ever since. Isolde looked at Genevieve with warm and knowing amusement and brought them wine that she described as from the estate, the Good Year, which turned out to be from a vineyard Zephyr's court had owned in France since the 16th century, and which was one of the finest things Genevieve had ever tasted. "You have so many things," she said, which was not what she had meant to say, but which was what came out. "Yes," he said with a wryness that was self-aware rather than boastful. 300 years is a significant amount of time to accumulate things. Does it ever feel like?" She paused, choosing the word carefully. "Wait." He considered this with the seriousness she had come to understand he brought to any question that deserved it. "Sometimes," he said, "the things I have lost feel like weight. The things I have kept feel less like weight than," he paused, "like anchors in the good sense, the things that tell me what I am." She thought about the wine and Isolde's warm amusement and the fact that a vampire who had been navigating courts and politics and centuries of history had chosen to anchor himself, in part, by caring quietly and consistently about the people who came into his orbit and needed caring for, Thomas Hollis and his mother. Rosalinda Dreveth, who had wanted to testify and been gently redirected by a man who was trying to contain the damage. Piotr, who had run a school. "Tell me something you have lost," she said. "That you have not told anyone." He looked at her across the table. Candlelight moved between them, warm and impermanent. "There was a library," he said, "in Constantinople, long before it was called that. A private library belonging to a court that does not exist anymore, whose name I am probably the only person alive who still remembers. I spent 6 years there, reading." He paused. "When the city fell, the library burned. I was not there. I learned of it after, and I have never gone back to that place, because I do not know what I would feel standing in a city that does not remember what it lost." Genevieve set down her wine glass. "What was in the library?" "Everything," he said. "Philosophy, history, poems, medical texts, things that no longer exist anywhere." A pause. There was a poet, human, short-lived, brilliant, who spent 2 years writing in that library while I was there. He read me his work before it was finished. I remember every word of it, but no one else ever read it. He died before it was copied. He looked at her. That is the weight of it, not the accumulation, the things that cannot be recovered. You remember his poems, Genevieve said. Yes, then they are not entirely lost, she said. They exist because you carry them. That is the purpose of an archive, not the building or the paper. The act of remembering. He looked at her, and this time she did not look away, and he did not look away, and the space between them was warm and quiet and real. Genevieve, he said. Yes, she said softly. I am going to tell you something, and I would like your honest response. I always give my honest responses, she said. I know, he said. It is one of the things I value greatly. He paused. I have lived a very long time. I have had attachments, and I have had losses, and I have learned to keep most of what I feel carefully managed, because immortality requires a certain economy of feeling, or you will be destroyed by it. He held her gaze, steady and unguarded. I am finding that economy increasingly difficult to maintain around you, and I would like to know whether that is. He stopped, and for the first time she saw something that was actually uncertainty in his expression. Whether that is something you are open to. She picked up her wineglass and held it for a moment, feeling the quality of the silence around them, and the weight of what was being asked, and the complexity of what it meant, practically and emotionally, to be with someone who had existed for centuries and would continue to exist after she was gone. She thought about all of that clearly and honestly, the way she thought about everything. And then she said, Zephyr, I called you from a bureau archive floor at 11 at night because I recognized your handwriting on a 300-year-old document, and I would not let it be used against you without understanding what it meant. I went to Vienna, I built a legal case, I stood in front of the Vampire High Court and argued for you. She set the wineglass down. I think you know what that means about where I am on the question. He was quiet for a moment, and then the smile happened again, that genuine startled thing that she had first seen on the plane over the channel, the one that was not controlled or aristocratic, but just real. I think I do, he said. Good, she said. Then we understand each other. The evidentiary proceeding concluded in October, 11 months after the documents had first landed on Genevieve's examination table. Lady Severane's final ruling was 48 pages long. Genevieve read all of it the morning it was released, sitting in the Bureau's restricted reading room with a cup of coffee and her reading glasses, and the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done thorough work and was watching it hold up under scrutiny. The ruling found that the vow of 1683 had been made under documented coercive threat to a third party, that the circumstances that had created the coercive condition no longer existed, and that under the old court code's provisions for exactly this situation, the vow was formally voided in its entirety. The Veltharian bloodline was ordered to make no further legal claims based on the document. Casimir Veltharion's attempted witness coercion resulted in a formal censure and a 2-year suspension of his right to petition the High Court, which was, in the vocabulary of vampire court politics, a significant blow to his standing. And this was the part that Genevieve read twice, sitting very still. Lady Severane's ruling included a formal recognition of the historical record of the 1683 massacre, which was entered into the High Court's official archives as a documented act of coercion by the Veltharian bloodline against the inhabitants of it in the eastern courts. The record was public. It would not be removed. The people of that village, who had been unrecorded for 3 centuries, now had a record. Thomas Hollis's father was named in the ruling. Piotr, educator, killed by Branimir Veltharion in November of 1683, Genevieve called Zephyr before she even finished the document. He answered immediately. "I know," he said. "Leofric has it." Lady Severaine included the massacre record, Genevieve said. "I read it," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "Piotr is named, yes." She heard something in the quality of his silence that she had learned over the past months to read, the particular compressed weight that meant he was feeling something significant and had not yet determined what to do with it. "Come to Vienna," she said. "I'll already be here for the formal ruling reception." "We can." She paused. "We could go to Salzburg. Find the Hollis family. Not to tell them everything, but something." A longer pause. "Yes," he said. "Yes to Salzburg or yes to Vienna?" "Both," he said. They went to Salzburg 3 days after the ruling reception, on a quiet Saturday morning, when the city was wrapped in autumn gold, and the smell of cold air coming off the mountains mixed with the smell of coffee from open cafe doors. They had looked up the current generation of the Hollis family, a woman named Miriam Hollis, 42, who taught secondary school history, which made Genevieve smile for reasons she did not immediately explain. And they walked to the street where she lived without any particularly clear plan. Zephyr stopped at the corner and looked at the building for a long moment. "We do not have to go further," Genevieve said, standing beside him. "I know," he said. "Whatever you decide is the right amount of contact," she said. "Is the right amount?" He was quiet, then he said, Piotr would have wanted her to know that his line mattered, that someone remembers. "Then tell her that much," Genevieve said. "You do not have to tell her everything at once. You have time." He looked at her, and there was a warmth in his expression that had been growing for months. Not the careful, managed thing she had first seen in the Bureau's consultation room, but something that had been let out into the air and was doing what things did when they were let out into air, which was to grow. "I have a great deal of time," he said. "I know," she said, "and I intend to use a great deal of it with you." She held his hand, which she had started doing somewhere around the 4th Vienna trip, and which had immediately, he felt, like something that had been natural for much longer than it had been happening, but not all of it standing on street corners. He looked down at their joined hands for a moment, and then he said very quietly, "I did not expect this." "What?" she said. "Any of it," he said. "The document finding its way to you specifically. You calling me. You going to Vienna. All of the months after. You," he paused. "I have planned and managed and controlled a great deal in my life. Because that is what survival required. I did not plan this." "No," she said. "Some things are not planned. They are found." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was an old-world gesture that should have felt theatrical, and instead felt entirely sincere. The act of a man who had very specific ways of expressing things that were too important for casual language. "Thank you," he said, "for finding it. The document," she said. "All of it," he said. She leaned up and kissed him, there, on the Salzburg Street corner, with the autumn light falling through the old trees and the distant sound of the city going about its mourning. And he kissed her back with the particular quality of someone who intended to do something very thoroughly and had determined that now was exactly the right time. When they finally rang the bell of Miriam Hollis's building, Zephyr held a piece of paper on which Genevieve had helped him write something brief and honest, that her ancestor Thomas Hollis had been a brave and beloved person, that his father had been a man of education and courage, and that there were people who remembered both of them with care. It did not explain the centuries. It did not need to. It said enough. Miriam Hollis was a tall woman with dark hair and an expression of intelligent curiosity that made Genevieve's chest feel warm in a way she did not immediately analyze, but recognized as connected to the fact that 3 centuries of quiet protection had resulted in this specific person standing in this specific doorway, looking at a piece of paper that told her she had not been forgotten. She invited them inside. She made tea. She asked questions that Zephyr answered carefully and honestly within the limits of what he could say, and Genevieve sat beside him and listened and watched him be, slowly, and with evident difficulty and evident relief, a version of himself that had been waiting for 340 years to put down part of its weight. They walked back through the Salzburg streets as the afternoon light shifted toward early winter gold, and Genevieve's hand was in Zephyr's, and neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet with words. "She looked like Thomas," Zephyr said finally. "I thought she might," Genevieve said. "He had that same expressions," he said, "when he was concentrating on something, as if the world had reduced itself to the one thing in front of him." He paused. "He used to concentrate on maps like that, small maps of the valley, very precise, drawn with whatever he could find. He became a cartographer," Genevieve said. "He became a cartographer." Zephyr agreed, and his voice was warm and sad and full of something that was neither of those things exactly but contained both. In the months that followed the ruling, their lives found a shape that was new and also felt, strangely, like something that had always been waiting to exist. Genevieve continued her work at the Bureau, which had been formally restructured in the aftermath of the Veltharion case. Director Ambrose had used the proceedings as justification for a series of reforms that tightened the archive's protections against politically motivated retrieval requests. Councillor Brentwood had quietly retired from the Oversight Committee. The Bureau, she thought, was better for all of it. She also took on a formal advisory role with the High Court, specifically in cases involving historical documentation, which was a new arrangement that Lady Severaine had proposed with a directness that suggested she had been considering it for some time. The role required periodic travel to Vienna, which suited Genevieve very well. Zephyr's court reconsolidated its position following the ruling, and Casimir Veltharion, his censure in place and his standing reduced, retreated from his most aggressive expansion campaigns. He was not defeated entirely. Men like Casimir never were, but he was checked, which was sufficient for the present. Zephyr proposed, on an evening in early spring, in the library of the London townhouse, that he had quietly begun sharing with Genevieve, in the way that things that start gradually become suddenly, obviously, inevitable. He did not use theatrical language. He was not theatrical by nature. He sat across from her with the particular quality of absolute attention she had come to know as specifically his, and he said that he wanted to spend however much time she would give him with her, and that he understood what that meant. That she was human and he was not, and that there were conversations they would need to have about what they wanted and what was possible and how they would navigate the future honestly, and that he wanted to have all of those conversations, the difficult ones and the complicated ones and the ones that had no clean answer, because she was the person he wanted to be having conversations with. "Are you asking me something specific?" Genevieve said. "Yes," he said. "Then ask it specifically," she said. He looked at her with that expression she had come to love, the one that was ancient and real and a little startled, and he asked. She said yes, there were conversations, as he had promised. There would be honest and complicated ones, about the nature of vampire gifts and the limits of what could and could not be changed, about what Genevieve wanted for her own life and what she was willing to consider and what she was not, about timelines and choices, and the kind of future that was possible when one person was immortal and one was not, and both of them were determined to be clear-eyed about it. Genevieve did not make any decisions in haste. She was not someone who made decisions in haste. She thought about things with the same thoroughness she brought to documentary analysis, and she asked questions, and she listened to the answers, and she took time. She took nearly a year, and at the end of that year, she made her choice with full information and full intention, and with the certainty of someone who had looked at the thing clearly from every angle, and found that it was still, clearly and undeniably, what she wanted. The ceremony, such as it was small and very private, witnessed by Leofric, who managed to be both official and visibly moved, by Isolde from the restaurant in London, and by Miriam Hollis, who had become, over the months of careful and gradual truth-telling, something like family to both of them. Afterward, in the garden of the house in Vienna that had become the place they returned to most often, an old garden, well tended, full of things that had been growing for a very long time. Zephyr stood behind her, with his arms around her, and his chin lightly on the top of her head, and they looked at the night sky together. "The poet from Constantinople," Genevieve said. "Yes? Tell me one of his poems," she said. "One of the ones you remember." He did. He spoke it slowly, in a language she did not know, and then translated it quietly, phrase by phrase, standing in the old garden with the stars overhead. And she listened with her whole attention to words that had been waiting in one person's memory for more than 1,000 years, and were finally, properly, being heard. When he finished, she turned in his arms and looked up at him. "You should write them down," she said. "Perhaps," he said. "I could help you archive them," she said, "properly, with context." He looked at her with the warmth that she had watched grow from something careful and managed into something very free and very sure, and he said, "I believe that might be the most romantic thing anyone has ever proposed to me. I am an archivist," she said. "This is how I say things." "I know," he said. "I love that it is how you say things." She smiled up at him, and the garden was quiet around them, and the city moved beyond the old walls, full of its living and its history, and somewhere in Salzburg, Miriam Hollis's daughter was drawing maps in school that she did not know were an inheritance from a cartographer whose name was finally, at last, in the record. The document that should not have existed had done. It turned out exactly what documents were supposed to do. It had preserved a truth until the right person was ready to read it. Genevieve thought, later, that this was the thing about archives that people who did not do the work never quite understood. The archive was not a storage facility. It was not a warehouse for old paper. It was a conversation across time, a record of what had been, waiting for the moment it could speak to what was. And sometimes, if the archivist was paying attention, what had been said 300 years ago was precisely the thing that needed to be heard right now. She had been paying attention to this. The garden, and the man beside her, and the stars that she had looked at from a bureau archive floor 11 months ago, while wondering if she was about to make a very large mistake. This was what that attention had found. She pressed her hand flat against his chest and felt the particular, quiet stillness of him. A heartbeat that was measured and old and completely unfrightened. Because there was nothing in the world he was afraid of now in the way that he had once been afraid of it, the specific fear of someone who had loved and lost and carried the weight of it alone for centuries. He was not alone now, neither was she, and the vow that had been written in fear and grief, and the particular desperation of a man trying to protect people who could not protect themselves, had found its true resolution at last. Not in a courtroom, not in a ruling, but here in the quiet of an old garden, where the man who had written it 340 years ago was no longer carrying it by himself. The record, at last, was complete.